Hey everyone, this is the second lecture for endocrine physiology. The first one was kind of looking at a broad overview of endocrine physiology, how we categorize different types of hormones and different signaling cascades. This one is specifically looking at different glands within the endocrine system, the hormones that are secreted from those glands, and identifying the key function of those hormones. So we're not going to cover every single hormone that's in the human body, but we are going to look at a few really important ones from each gland. That's going to help us build up a foundation for understanding nervous and reproductive physiology, as well as really teasing apart some of those ideas of homeostasis that we get into in the last couple of chapters. So as we go through this, for every single hormone on slides 4 through 26, you should know the gland in which it's produced and then the basic function as it's stated in the slides. So on the exam, I would not ask you any questions kind of in a rephrased way. I would state it very clearly, exactly the same way that it's written in the slides. So I recommend making flashcards for these. There will probably be at least one of these questions on the next lecture exam 2. These slides have been posted for a while, and I did tell you when we were still in class that you should go through and make those flashcards. So I recommend doing that as soon as you can. There will probably be at least a couple more questions on the final exam. And then generally you should know that some organs or systems have secondary endocrine functions. We'll talk about that on the last couple of slides. So for those, you don't need to memorize them. I just need you to understand broadly that some organs that we don't usually think about as being associated with the endocrine system actually do secrete hormones, and that those are important. You might need to know about them in nursing school or other classes. So it's good to have that foundation. So when we're thinking about specific endocrine glands, I'm going to work our way superiorly to inferiorly. So starting out at kind of the top towards our head and our brain, we have what's called the hypothalamic-pituitary axis. So that's just a fancy way of saying a bunch of stuff that includes the hypothalamus and the pituitary. We break the pituitary apart into anterior and posterior pituitary, and each of those holds, stores, produces, and secretes unique hormones. There are some that are produced in the hypothalamus and secreted from the pituitary. We'll think about how they travel, so a particular type of tissue that they travel through, and then some of those specific examples first. There's also the thyroid gland and the parathyroid glands. Again, we'll talk about the overall structure when we get to that section of the lecture. The adrenal glands, the pineal gland, will kind of jump back up to the brain, then move back down to the pancreas, and then the gonads. So here I state gonads. We're going to look at one example that is not secreted necessarily by the gonads. It's secreted by the placenta inside of the uterus. So just keep that in mind. Okay, so this is kind of a simplified look at that hypothalamic pituitary axis. You see the thalamus there. In this diagram, you can't see the hypothalamus, and you can't distinguish between the anterior and posterior pituitary. So let's zoom in and look at that. When we see this hypothalamic pituitary axis, which is also called the hypothalamic pituitary complex, there's the hypothalamus, the anterior pituitary, and the posterior pituitary. There's also this thing called the infundibulum, which is fun to say, and it's also called the pituitary stalk. So that is drawn in orange on this image right here, so you can see it right here. The infundibulum, also called the pituitary stalk. So that connects the hypothalamus and the anterior and posterior pituitary, and so sometimes hormones are secreted or travel along that tissue in order to be stored. For example, if you have damage to that infundibulum, it affects secretion of ADH, which is antidiuretic hormone. So when we're looking at that anterior and posterior pituitary, just to remind you of basic anatomical terminology, Anterior is going to be towards your face, posterior is going to be towards the back of your head. They're both in the same relative position in the brain, it's just that one is more towards the face, the other lobe is more towards the back of your head. So when we're looking at these different hormones, there's some key specific examples. There's the thyroid stimulating hormone, which is often abbreviated as TSH. We'll talk about that one again when we get to hormones of the thyroid, but as the name suggests, it stimulates the release of thyroid hormone from the thyroid. So a lot of these have pretty intuitive names. It is both produced and secreted by the anterior pituitary. Then there's ADH, which stands for anti-diuretic hormone. It's involved in reabsorbing water so that you increase blood pressure and decrease the volume of urine that is coming out of your body. So we'll talk a lot about that when we get to excretion and homeostasis. I'll talk about a case study in terms of how drinking alcohol and caffeine affect levels of that. But basically the goal of this is, its function is to upregulate the insertion of aquaporins into the plasma membrane of cells lining the collecting ducts of the kidney. So in the last lecture, I talked about how you can upregulate and downregulate the receptors that are found in the plasma membrane. You can also pop in these aquaporins, aqua meaning water, porin meaning a pore or channel, and so that basically opens up the membrane. Then when water passes through on its way through the collecting ducts to the ureters, bladder, and eventually urethra, if that area is open, it's kind of like the same idea as leaky capillaries, it lets material back into the body. So it's not staying contained in that vessel, which is the collecting duct. It is re-entering your body and then re-entering circulation. So ADH is part of that RAS, the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, which is designed to increase blood pressure in part by increasing blood volume and changing levels of sodium. So that is produced by the hypothalamus and it's stored in the posterior pituitary. It is stored in a different place from where it's produced. That's why if you have damage to that pituitary stalk, it's going to affect your secretion of ADH because it's not able to travel from where it is produced to where it is stored. There's also growth hormone, which I talked about in the previous lecture in terms of when we were talking about different possible outcomes. I said that one possible outcome of a chemical signaling molecule in the action of a hormone is growth, division. So growth hormone, or GH, is really important for that. It stimulates protein synthesis and the building of tissue, in part by encouraging mitosis, cell division, and growth. So that is both produced and secreted by the anterior pituitary gland. Finally, the last example from this section is oxytocin. That is produced in the hypothalamus and stored in the posterior pituitary. So oxytocin is often called the love chemical or the love hormone. It is produced a lot during childbirth. That kind of functionally plays two roles. One, it creates feelings of attachment and bonding with your child. It also is involved in creating those contractions. So it's kind of our classical example of a positive feedback loop. It is also released during breastfeeding, again associated with bonding and kind of also the lactation and letdown response. Bonding generally releases oxytocin, so any kind of physical proximity. That can be like a romantic partner. It can also just be between friends. It can be when you pet your dog. So there's lots of different stimuli that cause those happy, warm feelings, those feelings of attachment, and release that oxytocin. So again, that does include emotional and sexual responses, but it's not limited to that. So when we're thinking about some other key hormones, specifically key reproductive hormones that are produced in the pituitary gland and the hypothalamus, in the reproductive unit, we are going to go way in depth into this. At this time for this exam, you do not need to know these plots, but I will say that integrating the ovarian cycle, the uterine cycle, and fluctuating hormone levels is going to be very important when we talk about the reproductive system and reproductive physiology. So right now, when we're thinking about the hormones that are coming specifically from the brain, The ones that we're thinking about are GnRH, which stands for gonadotropin releasing hormone. Again, these sound super fancy, but this is just a hormone that causes gonadotropins to be released. So GnRH is produced and secreted in the hypothalamus. Its action, it acts on the cells of the anterior pituitary to release gonadotropins. So the two main gonadotropins are follicle stimulating hormone, or FSH. That is responsible for stimulating the production and maturation of gametes. So in the ovaries, we have follicles. We'll talk about kind of how a few of them develop at a time. One becomes the dominant follicle. That is going to continue this process of egg maturation and meiosis in order to have a fully mature egg released roughly every 28 days. So that's happening throughout follicular phase. So this follicle is being stimulated by follicular or follicle stimulating hormone. There's also luteinizing hormone, or LH, which spikes around right before ovulation. It actually triggers ovulation once it gets to that really high level and stimulates the release of estrogens and androgens from the ovaries and testes. So that is really important for, again, causing ovulation. It also kicks off the luteal phase. So luteal means white. It means gold. I was getting it confused with albicans. So there's the corpus luteum and the corpus albicans. Luteum means gold. If you've taken microbiology, you might have worked with Micrococcus luteus. That makes that yellow pigment at different temperatures. So that's like the golden body that basically the follicle transitions into after ovulation. If you've taken microbiology, you've probably also worked with the yeast Candida albicans. Albicans means white, and so after the corpus luteum begins to break down, it becomes the corpus albicans, and it turns white. So again, we'll unpack that a lot when we get into reproductive physiology, but that is a major written question for the final exam. So I want you to start thinking about these ideas and cueing into the idea that this is very important and that there's a lot to unpack here. So start building up that framework now so that when we get to the last exam, it's not as much of a hassle to memorize and to really understand. Obviously, I care more about you really understanding it than memorizing it, but we do what we can. So on that exam, it's going to be helpful for you to understand that different levels of these hormones have different effects. So the pluses indicate kind of more production or positive feedback. So those are green. The red minuses indicate negative feedback and decrease of production. So we see that during different phases, based on different levels of hormones, different hormones are receiving different information, different feedback. Those levels are fluctuating. Again, we kind of divide this up into follicular, ovulation, and luteal phase in terms of the ovarian cycle. So on that final exam, you are going to have to kind of broadly explain each of these in each of those different parts of the ovarian cycle. Again, not for this exam, but for the final exam. Okay, so getting into the thyroid, we'll start with the thyroid first and then talk about the parathyroid. The thyroid, I have a diagram of this on the next slide, but you should have learned this in anatomy. It consists of a lot of follicles. And so when you look at the histology of this, you can see those follicles as kind of big circles on a histological slide. They are lined with special cells. So there's the epithelial follicle cells and then the parafollicular cells in between those follicles. That central cavity of the follicle, the lumen, is filled with something called colloid. So that is a really sticky fluid. If you think about, like, for example, if you or your children have had chickenpox, they might have taken a colloidal oatmeal bath. So that's that kind of like, not necessarily sticky, but definitely cloudy and, it's an oatmeal bath. So it is sticky to some extent, but that's that sticky fluid that's inside of the follicles. So the production of the hormones that are coming from the thyroid is heavily dependent on iodine. You can see that at different points in this biosynthetic pathway in order to make different precursors, different intermediate structures, and ultimately get our end result thyroid hormones. You do have to have iodine at different steps of this process. So back in the day, people did not get enough iodine. Now we have iodized salt, where we as Americans eat more than enough salt. So it's kind of a trick. You put the iodine in with the salt, people eat their salt, their processed foods, and they get plenty of iodine. If you don't have enough iodine, you get what are called goiters. And so that's what's pictured in the two individuals on the left. The woman at the top, it's not as severe as the man at the bottom, but that kind of swelling around the neck is a goiter. So there's the normal thyroid gland in the diagram in the middle top. Below that, you can see that different nodules on that thyroid can become swollen, either individual nodules or overall the entire, if you have multiple nodules, so this multinodular goiter, that is where you get that really extreme swelling. So when you do have an iodine deficiency, I'm so used to talking about iron deficiency, but this is an iodine deficiency. That means that the thyroid can't produce enough thyroid hormone. So in the last slide, we saw that you need that iodine or iodide at different steps in order to produce those thyroid hormones. So that sends a signal to the pituitary that it needs to produce more thyroid stimulating hormone, because that's what encourages the production of these thyroid hormones. So the pituitary produces more thyroid stimulating hormone, but the problem is that that thyroid stimulating hormone doesn't just increase the production of thyroid hormone, it also increases growth of the thyroid tissue itself. So that thyroid tissue kind of grows out of control, and it's going to keep sending this signal that we need more thyroid stimulating hormone because we don't have enough thyroid hormone, when in reality the problem is not the amount of tissue available to do the work. The problem is that you don't have that iodine in order to actually allow those biochemical reactions to happen. So this is a problem with that feedback loop. So things are kind of like out of control. It's positive feedback where you should be kind of getting negative feedback. So when things are working correctly and you have plenty of iodine and you are able to make your thyroid hormones, those thyroid hormones include ones associated with metabolism, thyroxine, which is called T4, and triiodothyronine, which is called T3. Those are produced by the colloid. So within the colloid, within the lumen of that follicle, which you can see here, so in the bottom right of that image that just popped up, there's the follicle lumen that contains the colloid. That's where T4 and T3 are being produced and secreted from. Directly surrounding the follicle, kind of like making up the lining of it, is the follicular cell, and then in between different follicles you have parafollicular cells, which are sometimes called C cells. Those parafollicular cells produce and secrete calcitonin. So as the name suggests, calcitonin is involved in regulating blood calcium, and it actually gets activated and gets secreted when blood calcium levels are too high. So it acts on multiple different systems, meaning that cells in our bones and in our gut and in our kidneys all have the receptor for calcitonin. Calcitonin is secreted, it travels through the bloodstream, it comes across those different locations, binds to the receptors that it comes across, and has an effect. So to reduce blood calcium, you might integrate it into the bone so it's out of the blood. You might get rid of it through the gut and the kidneys. So that's different ways of kind of adjusting the levels of different electrolytes, different minerals, specifically calcium, in our blood. So when we're thinking about the parathyroid glands, those are very closely associated with the thyroid. Again, para means adjacent to or next to, and these are tucked in right on that posterior side of the thyroid. They're these little round circles or structures that are embedded in that posterior surface of the thyroid gland. They're separated out by thick connective tissue, and their tissue doesn't have those follicles. It is very dense. So if you look at a histological slide of the thyroid and parathyroid, which I had an image of in the last lecture, you can really see that the thyroid has these much bigger circles, those follicles with colloid in them, whereas the parathyroid consists of a lot of cells very densely packed together. So those cells include chief cells in the parathyroid gland. They are responsible for secreting parathyroid hormone. So again, a very intuitive hormone name. Now that acts opposite to calcitonin. It is produced when you have low blood calcium levels. There are receptors for it, again, in your bone, gut, and kidneys. And so that serves to reverse that process. It increases calcium levels, it activates vitamin D3. So now at this point, you're raising blood calcium levels back to the normal range. So calcitonin and parathyroid hormone constitute a negative feedback loop. They help balance out those levels of blood calcium. In any situation, if you have too much and that system is thrown out of whack, it's kind of like being on a seesaw with a weight imbalance. One is way heavier than the other, and so it's skewed in a single direction. If your parathyroid hormone is being produced too much, you have what's called hyperparathyroidism. So you've probably heard of hyperthyroidism and hypothyroidism because T3 and T4 are associated with metabolism. Hyper and hypothyroidism are associated with metabolic issues. Hyperparathyroidism, which is also called Fair syndrome, causes calcification in the brain because you have way too much calcium, and so you get these calcium deposits that are visible in this medical image. So the opposite, hypoparathyroidism, means that you don't have enough calcium because you're getting to those low levels of calcium. You don't have enough of this parathyroid hormone. Hypo is low, so you don't have enough calcium in your blood. That means that you can't really go through with muscle contraction or nerve conduction because calcium is so important in muscles and nerves. So getting into the adrenal glands, renal means kidney, ad means next to or on top of. So those adrenal glands are going to sit right on top of our kidneys. And the adrenal glands have really unique histology. Just like how the kidneys have a superficial cortex and a deep medulla, so too does the adrenal gland. If you look at a histological slide kind of running along that section, you can see different tissue layers. 3 of those are going to be part of the adrenal cortex: the zona glomerulosa, the zona fasciculata, and the zona reticularis. Those are all part of the adrenal cortex. And then we have the adrenal medulla. So there's different hormones that are produced in each of those locations. The adrenal cortex produces aldosterone. That is part of that renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system, or RES. That is responsible for increasing sodium ion levels. That increases blood pressure. And remember that ACE inhibitors, which inhibit angiotensin converting enzyme, serve to kind of stop this system from proceeding. The adrenal cortex also secretes glucocorticoids broadly and cortisol more specifically. Cortisol is responsible for increasing blood glucose levels. It's also a stress biomarker. So high levels of cortisol are associated with being under physiological stress. So oftentimes when people are kind of like looking at sleep training in babies, since it's hard to really tell if a baby is actually experiencing stress or if they're just like hungry or feeling something new or gassy, cortisol levels are measured, and cortisol levels are also measured in the parents to kind of see how they track or don't track through different kind of points of parenting. So it's an important stress biomarker, not just in parenting studies, but in a lot of other studies. It also reduces inflammation and suppresses the immune response. The problem is that if you suppress your immune response for too long, you get adrenal suppression, and you get all these other associated problems. It leads to immunological disorders. So that's something to look out for. Being under a constant state of stress really does have an effect on the body. The reflection for this week is about that idea of the physiological kind of hormonal and neurobiological sweet spot that is not so sweet that causes PTSD. And I did want to say that that particular article focuses quite heavily on Holocaust survivors. Veterans are also brought up in this context. But I've read a lot of articles about how living in extremely impoverished and oftentimes violent neighborhoods is just as likely to cause PTSD as going to war. So people are under these physiological states that put so much stress on their bodies that cause actual neurobiological and endocrinological problems. So it's important to recognize that. And oftentimes we talk about people being more likely to have a certain medical condition, but we don't talk about the sociological problems that lead them to be in that physiological state. So I just want you guys to keep that in mind when you're dealing with different patient populations, that the things they are experiencing are very real, not just to them, but it's physical, it's physiological. There's a documented reason why sometimes people react the way they do. So just a little comment on cortisol. Androgens are produced and secreted by the adrenal cortex. Those in the last lecture, we talked about synergistic interactions. These adrenal androgens act synergistically with gonadal androgens, and so they might influence libido. So they just are another source of those androgens. Epinephrine and norepinephrine are secreted by the adrenal medulla. So the first few were from different layers of the cortex. Epinephrine and norepinephrine come from the adrenal medulla. These are neurotransmitters as well, and they're released in response to acute short-term stress. They're part of that fight or flight mechanism of the sympathetic nervous system. So getting into the pancreas is super interesting because it has both endocrine and exocrine function. So we talked about it at the beginning of the semester when we talked about chemical digestion. We talked about that pancreatic or hepatopancreatic duct that kind of takes some of those digestive enzymes and pancreatic juices over to the intestines. But when you're looking at the actual tissue of that pancreas, there are these little things that look kind of like flowers. They're called islets. And when you look at the histology of them, you see a lot of these things called alpha and beta cells. There's actually two other types of cells, but alpha and beta cells make up about 95% of that tissue. So when we're looking at those different cells within the islets, each one is responsible for secreting different hormones. Alpha and beta cells act opposite to one another. Alpha cells secrete glucagon, which is secreted when blood glucose is low. That cues your body to tap into those reserves of glycogen. So glucagon is the hormone. Glycogen is that glucose that's packed together in its storage form, located in the muscles and the liver. Those alpha cells account for about 20% of each islet, whereas the beta cells constitute about 75% of each islet. So those ones secrete insulin. When blood glucose is high, that insulin is secreted, and that helps pack away that blood glucose as glycogen to bring blood glucose levels back down to normal. So if you are type 1 diabetic, your beta cells within the pancreas don't necessarily secrete insulin or don't secrete enough of it. So you have to kind of measure those insulin levels and inject yourself with insulin. The delta cells are less prevalent. Remember that the delta and PP cells only account for about 5% of the cells in each islet. Delta cells secrete somatostatin that is also released in the hypothalamus, stomach, and intestines. So again, this is kind of synergistic. It's released from different locations. It's responsible for inhibiting glucagon and insulin. So it kind of regulates this process. And then the PP cells secrete pancreatic polypeptide hormone that is involved in appetite and regulation of secretion. So these different hormones are all kind of involved in digestion and absorption and regulating what happens within our body after those happen. To kind of expand a little bit more on glucagon and insulin and how they act as a negative feedback loop, I have a couple more slides with different diagrams. So when we have hyperglycemia, hyper meaning high, glycemia, gly is sugar, cemia is talking about what's in the blood. This is elevated blood sugar. That cues the beta cells to release insulin. That insulin sends a signal to body cells to take up and use glucose and store that glucose as glycogen. We also inhibit gluconeogenesis. Remember that in that absorptive state, when you have plenty of blood glucose, there is no reason to go through this process of gluconeogenesis, the new formation of glucose. So that process is inhibited. When you're hypoglycemic, that is low blood sugar, that causes the alpha cells to release glucagon. Glucagon causes the body cells not to take up glucose. Instead, glycogen in the liver is broken down, so whatever blood glucose you do have stays in the blood. It increases as you break down glycogen, and it also encourages gluconeogenesis. So that's that stimulation of the new formation of glucose from other molecules. So remember, in hyperglycemia, when glucose is stored as glycogen, that's glycogenesis. In hypoglycemia, when glycogen is broken down, that's glycogenolysis. So to kind of bring it back to that seesaw metaphor, if there's an imbalance, like your blood glucose level is going too high or too low, then your pancreas and your liver are going to react to that. So kind of briefly shooting back up to the brain, your textbook kind of hops around about with these different hormones, but the pineal gland is kind of tucked in near that hypothalamus, or the hypothalamus pituitary axis, and so you can see it in the kind of boxed off red box in the top left, but in these images on the right, it's also highlighted in green. So that top image is a sagittal plane of the brain, and you can see it. You can't see it, let me just highlight it right there. So right there, that's the pineal gland on this sagittal cut of the brain. And then down here, this partial transverse plane, you can see that pineal gland right there. So that pineal gland is important for secreting a hormone called melatonin, which a lot of you have probably heard of. The pineal gland is also involved in a lot of like new age kind of Berkeley-esque types of kind of like clearing your pineal gland type of things. So that is something that you might come across, but it's also important for producing melatonin. So remember in the last lecture, we talked about those amine derivatives. These are different hormones that are similar to tyrosine and tryptophan, and so they have that carboxylic acid. There's kind of like this amino structure, but obviously this is quite modified from what the amine originally looks like. So it is a modified version of this amine. It's an amine hormone, and it's derived from serotonin. It basically increases levels of drowsiness and helps kind of monitor your circadian rhythm, and it responds to light. So when you have increased levels of light, that downregulates melatonin production so you don't feel as drowsy. And so this is kind of correlated with a day period. That's why proper sleep hygiene involves, several hours before bed, dimming lights, using a blue light filter, using blue light glasses, so that you're not receiving those light cues, and so you have decreased levels of light, that upregulates melatonin production, and that leads to increased feelings of drowsiness and kind of getting your circadian rhythm on track for that night dark period. So one thing I want to say is that melatonin does not make you fall asleep necessarily. It's really about setting up proper sleep hygiene. It's something that you monitor levels of over a several hour period. I actually take Benadryl every morning because it makes me a lot less anxious. So if you are neurotic, then Benadryl might be really helpful for you. I also take 1 or 2 right before bed because Benadryl doesn't really make me tired, but it makes me not anxious enough so that I fall asleep. Benadryl knocks my husband out. And so Benadryl will like make you tired and sleepy and help you fall asleep. Melatonin is just kind of involved in adjusting your circadian rhythm. So sometimes it does really help people, especially if you just kind of have your levels off a little bit and you need some assistance with that. Taking melatonin can be very helpful. Some people, it does make you drowsy to some extent. So some people find that very useful and it does help them fall asleep. But generally you want to take it not right before you're trying to go to bed, maybe like an hour or 2 before you're trying to go to bed, just so you start adjusting your kind of levels of energy. It's also very useful when you're traveling, especially if you are experiencing huge jumps in time zones. So melatonin is often taken by travelers as they're kind of getting over their jet lag and adjusting to their new time and circadian rhythm. So I've actually taken these gummies before. You can get them at Target. They taste delicious, but they have melatonin in them. And melatonin has been become quite popular. Google Trends data is so interesting because it tells you a lot about how people are thinking about things. I kind of looked at the Google Trends data recently for COVID-19 and coronavirus, and it's just super interesting. But the way it works is 100 does not represent 100 people or even 100,000 people. It represents the max number of searches about a particular topic. 0 represents like the bottom number of searches. So if it's something that everyone thinks about, the 0 on Google Trends might still represent like 50,000 people a day looking at something. It just depends on how many people look at it. But when we look at this data of people who have searched for the word melatonin from 2004 to present, we can see that it kind of fluctuates, but it really does increase over time. We see kind of recurring peaks, which that's an interesting pattern, and I think that might be a little bit after the switch to daylight savings time, but that's an interesting kind of repeated pattern. Sorry, I'm getting distracted by data. So clearly people are getting more and more interested in melatonin. Okay, so then finally getting to kind of reproductive broadly hormones, we're going to talk about a few different types of hormones. One thing that I want to say is I'm going to talk a little bit about intersex folks at the end of this. We often talk about ovaries as being female and testes as being male. It is really not that simple, and we talk about estrogen as being a female hormone and testosterone as being a male hormone. Those are found in different levels in every body. So regardless of your chromosomal or anatomical or any type of sex or gender, those are just kind of associated with particular cycles. We might talk about them as female and male for simplicity's sake, but it is really not that simple. So when we're thinking about hormones that are secreted by the ovaries, 2 big players here are estrogens and progesterone. Estrogens include estradiol, estriol, and estrone, and they are involved in the development of reproductive systems, specifically what's considered the female reproductive system. They help regulate the menstrual and ovarian cycle, so the uterine and the ovarian cycle, and they're involved in the development of secondary sex characteristics. Estrogens also actually function in regulating fluid and electrolyte balance, and they stimulate protein synthesis. Progesterone is often called the pregnancy hormone. It's associated with regulating, again, the menstrual cycle, but also for preparing the body for and maintaining pregnancy. It's also important to understand that different levels of estrogen have different effects, and that kind of ties back to understanding, all those different feedback loops I showed you earlier in the lecture when we were talking about gonadotropins and gonadotropin releasing hormone. So when you have kind of moderate to low levels of estrogen, that actually has an inhibitory effect. It stops GnRH release, which means that you are not secreting as much LH and FSH, because that GnRH is what's telling your body to release LH and FSH. However, when levels of estrogen increase past a certain point, that actually stimulates GnRH release, which stimulates the secretion of LH and FSH. So we'll think about what causes that switch when we get to reproductive systems. It kind of has to do with the ovaries and the follicles developing. The placenta also secretes hormones. It does a lot of crazy, amazing stuff. Right before a baby is born, like half of their blood is still outside their body, and the placenta basically does a blood transfusion to push that blood into their body. That's why a lot of doctors now recommend delayed cutting of the cord, so that you really make sure you maximize the time for the placenta to finish pushing blood into baby's body. Basically, if the cord and the placenta are still pulsing, you don't necessarily want to cut the cord just yet. So there's kind of trade-offs there, but the placenta is amazing. It is also, just like a fun placenta fact, its DNA is your baby's DNA. So this is an organ that grows in your body and gets quite large, but like the DNA that's inside of it, the inside of that nucleus is the exact same as the baby's DNA. It's not the carrying parent's DNA, which to me is just wild. Like, you're growing this huge organ inside of your body and it's not even technically your organ. Insane. So one really important hormone that is secreted by the placenta is human chorionic gonadotropin. That is released by the placenta to maintain the uterine lining. So basically, hey, there's a baby in here, don't, start that menstrual cycle, keep the uterine lining in place. And it also reduces the maternal immune response, because I love my daughter more than anything in this world, but babies are essentially endoparasites, and they have very different immunology and physiology oftentimes than the carrying parent. So the carrying parent sometimes recognizes, hey, that is different, maybe we should attack it. So the maternal immune response has to be suppressed so that it doesn't attack the baby. That's what we kind of think about when we're talking about, for example, Rh sensitivity. This is also why pregnant folks are often very susceptible to things like listeria, listeriosis, food poisoning, and different colds, because they have that suppressed immune response to keep their baby safe. So when we're doing a pregnancy test, those pregnancy test kits basically have a strip with antibodies in it. That antibody binds to the hormone, human chorionic gonadotropin, because that HCG should only be present if you have a fetus and a placenta. So it detects that hormone. I say should only be present, but there have been a lot of situations where guys have peed on these sticks before and then got a positive test result, and they laugh because it clearly can't be pregnant, but then it turns out they actually have a type of cancer. So I'm not sure if it's prostate cancer or testicular cancer, but different cancers are associated with actually testing positive for human chorionic gonadotropin. So the follow-up question I get a lot for that is, can this then be used as basically a cancer screening test? To some extent, yes, it technically could be, but it's not designed for that. So it's not necessarily sensitive enough. It might give false positives or false negatives. So it's not designed for that, so we don't necessarily want to use it for that purpose. I have a lot of friends in biology right now who are so frustrated with the COVID-19 testing. They're like, I can do all of these experiments that are required to test for COVID-19. Why aren't we being trained? Why aren't we getting HIPAA training? Why can't we do the testing? Because test kits are so sensitive, and the emotional fallout for telling someone they are positive for infection with something really is something you have to be very careful about. That's why clinical lab scientists go through so much training. So you have to have a kit, a test that is really quality controlled. You have to have someone who has the right training to perform and interpret that test. So it can be used to detect cancer, but it shouldn't necessarily be misused for that purpose. The placenta also secretes estrogens and progesterone, so there's a lot of hormonal fluctuations happening there. In terms of what's produced by the gonadal tissue of the testes, there's testosterone, which is involved in the development of the male reproductive system, so people with sperm. It helps with maturation of sperm cells and the development of secondary sex characteristics. Inhibin is another hormone secreted by the testes that we'll talk about when we get to reproductive physiology. As the name suggests, it inhibits the secretion of FSH. So in doing that, it indirectly regulates spermatogenesis because FSH is involved in the production and maturation of gametes. So I wanted to kind of briefly talk about androgen insensitivity syndrome. I verbally discussed this when I was talking about receptors. This is what's called an intersex condition. And basically an intersex condition is any condition in which someone's body doesn't fit neatly into the binary that we have in place for anatomy, for gametes, and for chromosomes. So remember, I showed you this diagram where we have the ligand, the signal coming from a certain cell. It binds to a target cell that has a receptor, and there's a response. Some cells do not have the receptor. That's great if they're not the target cell, but if the target cell does not have the receptor, then you're not going to have a response. So in androgen insensitivity syndrome, the androgens are being produced, but the cell is not sensitive to them because it lacks the receptors for them. So the cells can't receive information and respond to them. So there might be different forms of this. The person might have external female genitalia, they might have external male genitalia. There's kind of different ranges of this. The tricky thing is that a lot of intersex folks have had forced gender reassignment surgery. So before they could consent or do anything about, their bodies or understand anything about their bodies, their parents were presented with a choice. Do you want to raise your child as male or female? The parents made the choice, and then the surgery was done to basically reassign their gender. I say gender reassignment surgery in that context, but it's really sex reassignment surgery, it's tricky because it's not gender affirming surgery, it's removing someone from their actual gender and sexual identity. So intersex is its own kind of sexual state in terms of kind of sex determination. These individuals can have two X chromosomes, or they can have an X chromosome and a Y chromosome. It just kind of depends. So there's an Intersex Society of North America that actually advocates for people with intersex conditions. And then there's two activists/artists who are actually sisters who have androgen insensitivity syndrome. The woman on the left is named Phoebe Hart, and the woman on the right is named Bonnie Hart. They were both went through this surgery process. One of them consented to it, but she was like a child, so she couldn't really give informed consent. And they did not know that the other was also experiencing androgen insensitivity syndrome. So they are two examples of folks with this, and they were raised as women, and they identify as women. But that's definitely not the case for everyone. There's lots of people with androgen insensitivity syndrome who identify as male, and then there's people who use they, them pronouns and identify as non-binary. And one example of those people is Pigeon Pagonis. They're an intersex activist, writer, filmmaker, artist, and they were born with androgen insensitivity syndrome. They were told they had ovarian cancer, and to explain kind of some of the symptomology, and were raised as a woman, but they actually have testes. They never even had ovaries, so how could they have ovarian cancer? So they have become quite outspoken about what it means to be intersex. I don't think that I can play this video within the functionality of PowerPoint in terms of how I record lectures, but I am going to link it on our Canvas page. So I really encourage you to watch this quick video. It explains a lot of really helpful biological ideas about what it means to be intersex. The reason I bring this up isn't to be like radical, it's because 1 in 50 people are born with an intersex condition. So it is exceedingly common. We pretend like it's not, but it is very common. And as we restore people's rights in terms of their bodily autonomy, we are going to encounter a lot more people who are kind of visibly intersex, or, you know, you don't have the right to know what's happening in terms of people's genitals or anatomy. So someone could be intersex and you could not know about it, and you don't have to know about it if you are just treating everyone with respect. So as clinicians, you are going to encounter patients who are intersex. You should kind of know what that means and know what the implications are for them. And I'm going to try to click this, but I don't think I'm going to be able to play it. No. So it's okay. I'm going to link it and you can watch it. One of the things that I really am excited for with Zoom is I'll be able to play more YouTube videos. So we will get to that. Oh, maybe. Oh, yay. Okay, it is working. Okay, so I'm glad that I was able to capture their video, audio in this PowerPoint. But if there are any problems with how that was processed, I'll make sure it gets fixed when I repost this. So just really briefly, I wanted to talk about some of those organs that do have secondary endocrine functions. For example, the heart, which we think about in terms of pumping blood, actually secretes a hormone. It's called atrial natriuretic peptide, or ANP, and it basically opposes the RAS system. So it lowers blood volume, it lowers blood pressure, and it also lowers concentrations of sodium. The kidneys secrete renin. That is important for the renin-angiotensin-aldosterone system that raises blood volume and also pressure. They also secrete erythropoietin. So they basically monitor levels of oxygen in your blood. This was that altitude sickness case study. And they secrete that erythropoietin, which is responsible for triggering erythropoiesis, the production of red blood cells. The liver produces insulin-like growth factor, or IGF-1, that is important for general growth, especially growth of bones. Angiotensinogen, which is again involved in RAS, which is responsible for increasing blood pressure. It also secretes thrombopoietin. So remember, platelets are thrombocytes, so thrombopoietin is involved in the production of platelets, and hepcidins, which are involved in iron regulation. The thymus secretes a group of hormones called thymosins. Those are involved in the development and differentiation of immune cells. So there's also the GI tract. That's stuff like gastrin and secretin and CCK. Gastrin is produced in the stomach to promote hydrogen chloride release. Secretin and CCK and other enzymes act on the pancreas for buffering and glucose regulation. In the skin, cholesterol, which is in the plasma membrane of cells in the skin, is converted to a precursor of vitamin D when exposed to UV light. So this is involved in regulation of vitamin D. Adipose tissue secretes leptin, which is very important for binding to neurons and regulating hunger and bone metabolism. And the skeleton actually secretes hormones. It secretes fibroblast growth factor 23, or FGF23, which regulates levels of vitamin D and phosphorus. Osteocalcin stimulates production of insulin. So please make sure that you're staying up to date on our plan for the semester. Keep an eye out for different reflections and quizzes, especially since I can't remind you in class, and continue preparing for lecture exam 2. It will be done online. I sent out some information about that yesterday, so please make sure you're prepared for that.